Welcome then to the fourth lecture in this series on metaphysics, and we are at the present going through the legacy of Parmenides and Zeno and on then into the Pythagoreans. What we have then in the Eleatics, Parmenides and Zeno, are two sets of arguments for a metaphysical monism, the idea that the universe is of one thing, one kind. In Parmenides, the argument for this is heavily reliant, entirely reliant really, on the idea that one can't speak of what is not. Therefore, this forces the idea that everything that is able to be spoken of is of one kind. Being is of one kind. Now you may ask then, what is Zeno's role? Zeno is Parmenides' pupil. What does he do? Well, what Zeno does is significant because he gives supporting arguments for Parmenides' monism, but does so without relying on Parmenides' main premise that that which is not cannot be spoken of. Instead, he uses different arguments to support Parmenides' conclusion, and that is significant. Then he has allowed us to see that Parmenides' monism might have some plausibility because it's supported by multiple arguments, multiple premises. So there we have a reason to take Parmenides' argument more seriously than we had, perhaps, than when we just had Parmenides' argument by itself. Okay. Now, I said that Parmenides may well have been a renegade Pythagorean. That's something that is said by a much later figure, many centuries later. Diogenes Laertius, in the Lives of the Philosophers, says this. We have no idea really whether that's true, and we have much reason to doubt Diogenes Laertius's account, since it is gossipy and often unsupported by other evidence. But nevertheless, it is a possibility, since the Pythagoreans were in a location which is not very distant from Elea, which is where Parmenides was situated. And it's possible that Parmenides could have gone to the Pythagoreans, learned what he could have done, and then gone away, or that he was simply influenced indirectly by some Pythagorean philosopher. We don't know. And it's possible that that's, again, not true, since we have another tradition in which Parmenides is really the pupil of Xenophon of Colophon. Again, we don't know. There's nothing much in Parmenides to suggest the Pythagorean origin, but there's also not much to suggest an origin in Xenophanes of Colophon, because, well, Xenophanes does not really tell us very much in philosophical terms. He does seem to deny the importance of the gods. He's not a believer in the Olympians. All of that is a silly fable to him. Instead, he seems to have some idea of a single dominant god, but we don't know what that is and what it amounts to. We do have the idea, of course, of a god, S, in Parmenides. Is that the same god that Xenophanes was speaking of? We don't know. So we've got then something of an historical puzzle as to what Parmenides' philosophical ancestry was. Let's now move then to one question, because much of our understanding of the early Pythagoreans, Pythagoras' teachings themselves, have been caught up in this idea that they must be some sort of have an ancestral relation to the views of Parmenides. So what then is the Pythagorean view in its early state, in the 6th century BC? Well, that is an interesting question, which we come to now. So now we come to Pythagoras and the Pythagoreans. And it is no overstatement to say that they probably had the largest effect on Greek philosophy and then on subsequent philosophy of all of the early philosophers that there were. Pythagoras himself is something of a mystery. He is supposed to have been born in Samos, an island not very far from the coast of Turkey, current modern-day Turkey. And he was born around about, the beginning of the 6th century, probably around 575, maybe 585, early at any rate. He is meant to have travelled in Egypt, particularly, and that's significant for his later philosophy. There are claims that he studied with the priests in Egypt and that they taught him some of their secrets, which they did not give out lightly or to many people. They did not write them down even. But it may be from that Pythagoras got his particular philosophy. For one thing, the Pythagoreans from early on had this idea about the immortality of the soul, reincarnation, the idea that the soul goes on and that it may come back in different forms, or that it may go on and into a form of immortality in the stars, which all sounds Egyptian. From early on, that seems to have been their view, and whether they originated it, and that origination is thought to have come from Egypt, or whether they did come from Egypt and became the Pythagorean view, it's unclear. And it's unclear because Pythagoras and the early Pythagoreans wrote nothing down. Everything that we know about Pythagoras comes from much later, usually around 700 years later. So Pythagoras becomes almost a mythical character. Obviously, he existed because early on we have testimony of the importance of the Pythagoreans, particularly in Plato. But there is not very much known about Pythagoras himself, other than that he seems to have been a very wise man. He was learned, cultured. He almost certainly had mathematical interests. The later development of the Pythagoreans would be inexplicable without that. He had mathematical interests, but the early Pythagoreans were also known for their mystical or religious views. As I say, the idea of reincarnation or the immortality of the soul was one particular view, but the value of looking at the structure of the universe, of paying due homage, at least to some extent, to the gods by performing sacrifices, the idea that there were prohibitions on what one could eat, perhaps even on the kind of material that one could wear. He may have got from the Egyptians the idea that one should not dress in wool, that linen was the appropriate clothing for the righteous man, if you like, or the righteous person, because they were not exclusionary of women at all. They were accepting. He seems to have mixed in some of the southern Italian religions, or perhaps introduced them to this area. The idea of a reverence for Orpheus, because of Orpheus's connection to music, and the idea of music as an important source of harmony in the universe, and harmony analyzed in a mathematical way is almost the essence of what one could say is early Pythagoreanism. So we have a good amount of understanding that we can accumulate, but there also seems to have been a prohibition on writing things down. That is, an insistence on a purely oral transmission of doctrine and ideas. So that is why nothing much has come out of from the early Pythagoreans, why we only know it later. And there was even a prohibition in an odd way on speaking of the Pythagoreans in a way that is not easy to understand. Herodotus mentions things which seems to directly point to the Pythagoreans, but says he won't name them. Why? Plato is absolutely infected with a huge amount of Pythagorean doctrine and interests and concerns. It is almost the entirety of Platonic doctrine, and yet Plato doesn't mention Pythagoras by name more than once in the Republic. So there's a great deal about this that is very mysterious and that it's not easy to understand or explain. There seems to have been in order to become a Pythagorean, there seems to have been a long apprenticeship process. It's said to be 3 years of silence, of saying nothing for 3 years, after which one was finally admitted into the, as it were, the inner sanctum where the Pythagorean doctrine was revealed. All of this is very, it's baffling to a sort of a modern historian and a modern mind to think of what we are dealing with here. It's not clear. At any rate, what we do have, the Pythagoreans existed for the longest time. There were Pythagoreans who were traveling around Greece and Italy into the Roman period in the 1st century AD. Now that is some 800 years after the foundations of the Pythagoreans. Pythagoreans were present, and the only ones present, according to the Phaedo, the dialogue of Plato, the only ones present at the death of Socrates. The Pythagoreans exerted through Plato a an influence that lasted for well over 1,000 years. You come to the Renaissance, it is Pythagorean and Platonic ideas that are being revived in surprising ways and all over the Renaissance. Almost everything that one can identify in astronomy is really the Pythagorean influence. In Tycho Brahe, in Galileo, it is everywhere. And it lasts as an influence, continues on even through the Romantic poets. Something that's not very well appreciated and understood, even in the Romantic poets, there is a revival of interest of Platonic doctrine, which is really a Pythagorean doctrine. And it lasts until the beginning of the 20th century, when many of these doctrines are expressed in the arts and the sciences, even in such things as, and diverse as Rilke's poems to Orpheus. These Orphic strands are one of the strands of Pythagoreanism and Platonism that go all the way back to the early 6th century BC and the Greeks. So what we are dealing with here is an extraordinarily long-lived doctrine, and a doctrine that has both a religious side and a mathematical side, and that these two sides were brought together in harmony by the doctrine of harmony. Harmony becomes, in Plato, the binding force for the universe, the way of understanding everything, including the ruling of the state, how the state should be ruled, which goes all the way back to the Pythagoreans from the very beginning, to how a human being should live, how that harmony should be expressed in human terms, in personal terms. And in the generation of mathematical doctrines that find its full early flowering in the work of Euclid, which was then built upon by subsequent mathematicians such as Proclus in the what we call the Common Era, in the period of 5th century CE, as we call it, AD, if you like. So we have two parts of this Pythagorean doctrine, religious and secular, mathematical, and these two parts relate to one another. The question then is, what was the core of that doctrine? And again, we have quite a bit of information from 1st, 2nd, 3rd century AD. Some information we can glean from Plato and Plato's writings, but much of it, one has to remember, always, much of this has to be understood as rather conjectural. We are making guesses, informed guesses, as to what the Pythagoreans were saying very early on, what their doctrine was. One part of it was based on something that was called later the Tetractys. So the Tetractys is a simple object. It's the first 10 numbers arranged in the form of a triangle. 1 is at the top, then underneath that 2 and 3, then underneath that 4, 5, and 6, and then underneath that 7, 8, 9, and 10. That tetractys had it seems a remarkable importance to the Pythagoreans. One thing is, everyone in a sense now knows about square numbers. You learned that in school. Everyone understands what a square number is. The tetractys gives you triangular numbers. And triangular numbers have their own significance and importance. And the Pythagoreans investigated this and understood this. This is one of their great discoveries, if you like. Square numbers went back much earlier, much earlier. The tetractys became a symbol of the unification of mathematical concepts, numerical concepts, and ideas in religion, in the harmony that one finds in the tetractys was taken to translate across into the harmony of the universe. And the relationship between those two, the binding relationship between those two, was music. And one finds, I'll come back to that, one finds this idea of the tetractys repeated over and over again as a symbol. It comes up in many places. It comes up because of its importance in religion, in the Pythagorean religion. It comes up in mystical doctrines. It comes up over and over again in, for example, the Kabbalah. It's there. One finds the tetractys repeated in various ways, and when you find it, then it seems to contain within itself as a symbol of harmony and unity and numericalization of nature, the mathematicalization of nature. So that idea is something that we will come to. It'll be the basis of the next lecture, where I'll go into how harmony arises out of the tetractys. Okay, I'll see you then, my friends.